welcome to the KU Summer Community Webinar Series. I'm joined by Dr. Herbert Jelinek. We're going to be talking about anxiety today, correct?
That's right, yes, thank you.
Let's start then. What's anxiety?
Well, anxiety is actually something where you're overreacting to something. So you're continuously worried is one aspect, or also in various situations that you might find yourself in, you can feel your heart really pounding, doesn't stop, you're sweating, you can't sleep, things like that. That's really a definition of anxiety.
How can I tell if I have it?
Well, you can tell that you've got it because you, for instance, may not want to go to a job. Okay, so that's job anxiety. That could be one aspect of it. Certainly, before you get, you might think, oh, I'm not going to get out of bed today because I've got to go to work, or you slow down and you're slowing yourself down to get ready. You're not sort of jumping out of bed joyful. When you get there, you try and hide. You don't talk to people, especially with people or staff that you don't get on with, and you would certainly always feel sort of stressed.
Okay, so this is kind of like not a long-term thing, but it's not just a one-off, I've got a high heart rate, it's continuous every time I go to work, for example.
Yes, and you'll find that your sleep patterns may change. You might also, if you are a smoker or a drinker, you might start smoking more, which actually makes it worse, or you might drink more because it actually makes it worse. So you would notice that appetite might change as well. In some instances, it might even get worse, where you end up having diarrhea, for instance. That's another one.
Yeah, and it's not just job anxiety, for example. There are other types?
Yes, that's true. So I was mainly talking about general anxiety, but then you also have things like phobias. So people know about, for instance, snake phobias or spider phobias. There's also things like lift phobias. So you get agoraphobia, where people don't like leaving their house. For instance, that's another type. The worst one possibly could be post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
There's another type of anxiety, but the anxiety there is about having been involved in traumatic experience. So, for instance, you may have, that can be, for instance, in war. It can be now in terms of refugees, when they're in the camps, when they have to go cross over the Mediterranean and a 20-foot wave comes to them, that can cause PTSD, those sort of aspects that would then change your whole persona. So, for instance, I've had patients, where post-traumatic stress disorder was induced because somebody was in a traumatic event where a phone was ringing. So this person now, every time they hear a phone on the streets, just totally goes into meltdown.
They get that reaction?
Yes, they go into meltdown. So that's post-traumatic stress disorder, which is probably the worst.
So without negating how much of an effect general anxiety can have on your life and how difficult it can be to live with, we're kind of looking at that being at one end of the scale from the post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes. And generalized anxiety, how common is that?
It's actually very common. It's up to about 7% usually in the population. Worldwide, or in America, it's about 280 million people or something worldwide, 280 million people. Interestingly enough, in the UAE, it's actually quite high.
Oh.
So we've been reporting around the 20-odd% in the population anxiety. And in the current era of COVID-19, this has actually increased to about 50. Now, if you're looking at anxiety in terms of war, conflict areas, you might end up having roughly 28%. So you can see that the COVID-19 has made a huge impact on society, and especially in the UAE.
Yeah, and that's anxiety about catching it or being in large groups.
Yes, that's right. And now also with, in fact, with vaccination. So anything to do with COVID tends to bring this COVID anxiety upon. Yeah, so going to large groups. Even like, for instance, if you're having to get a PCR test, you have to go into these large tents. So we're for instance, looking into, in fact, the department has developed, for instance, an app where people can test themselves for whether they are at risk of COVID, and hence if they're not, they can then decide, oh, hang on, do I actually need a PCR? So unless I have to have it for work, etc., people in the population can actually try to reduce their contact with areas where they might be more in contact, or their likelihood of being in contact with COVID would decrease.
And would you always need an event to kind of trigger an anxiety, or how do you get it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So some people just end up having it. And, you know, from a biological perspective, we've got various parts of the brain, and some of them are actually geared towards stress in essence.
Like fight or flight, I suppose?
Yeah, that's one. So fight or flight is an example of that. And associated with these brain areas, we have various chemicals. They're called neurotransmitters. So if I have an imbalance of these neurotransmitters, you may end up having behaviors associated with anxiety. So we have, for instance, the front part of the brain, and then we have something in the middle there. It's called the amygdala. And the front part of the brain keeps this amygdala in check. Mm-hmm. If the front part of the brain doesn't work as well as it should, the amygdala is out of check, and all of a sudden you end up getting these symptoms of and signs of anxiety.
So other than putting yourself in potentially traumatic situations, is there any way of preventing getting anxiety?
Well, yes, and yes and no.
Okay.
So if you are biologically already in that risk category, so that there is some neurological aspect to this, well, then it's unlikely that you're going to be able to do something about it. However, even then, the very simple rules apply to everybody. So if you are drinking or smoking, you reduce those. Exercise, nutrition, and sleep.
Right.
They're always the ones that work.
Look after yourself is what you're saying.
Yeah, that seems to sort of reduce everything, including anxiety.
But if you've got it then, can you mitigate it at all? How is it treated?
Again, so there's a number of things. So if you do have a very serious case of anxiety, so like we were saying, you might end up with diarrhea, and you can't sleep, and you know your heart rate just doesn't slow down, and you're pounding away. Well, I think you need to see a physician. That's the number one. So you go and see your family doctor and talk to them about it. They may, in the short run, give you some medication, so you can have these anti-anxiety medication. I think they're called benzodiazepines. Valium is quite a common one that's utilised then. In the long term, you may get some other antidepressive medication, for instance, or the other option, if you're not on medication, you can do something called cognitive behavioural therapy, so that's through a psychologist. And then you can also do things for yourself, like as I said, reduce everything and improve factors like sleep if you can. The other one, which is quite good, is utilising mindfulness or relaxation. So there are lots of people using telephones these days, smartphones. They all have relaxation apps on there that allow you to follow breathing, or you can listen to the waterfalls dropping. Any of those, as long as you're starting to relax, helps. And then you can also do mindfulness courses, for instance, that are very helpful because they give you information on other things that you can do. So there's a thing called, for instance, body scan, where you just become very aware of all your muscles throughout the body. And as you relax your muscles in the body, you become more relaxed. And if you do this on a continuous basis, it needs to be done maybe 20 minutes a day and kept up. If you do that, there's a high likelihood that the anxiety levels will decrease. And as I mentioned, there's also biofeedback, for instance. So I'm, for instance, very bad in meditating because I do always wander, and they do say mind wandering isn't a bad thing, but I like something which kind of guides me. So biofeedback is good because it guides you. It shows you breathe in, breathe out, or you've got a balloon there that you need to go and rise up into the air. So biofeedback tends to work. Now, just why it works is because when you're breathing in a particular breathing pattern, the nervous system, in essence, combines the breathing, so the lungs, with the heart rhythm, and all of that information ends up going to certain parts of your brain that actually then modulates those kind of activities and decreases them, so that, again, you decrease your anxiety levels.
Okay, interesting. We'll come back to that, and we'll come back to therapy in a second as well. I just wanted to ask one more question about the medication side of things. How, in simple terms, how does that affect the brain when you take it? Does it kind of help bring the neurotransmitters back into balance, or?
Well, that's right. So, for instance, we're talking about one specific one, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So serotonin is a kind of mood neurotransmitter. It makes you feel good, like noradrenaline. What happens is that it gets released from certain neurons, and then they have to act. The serotonin acts on another neuron to have something happening. What happens is that there's not enough serotonin being released in the first place. So what we do with the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, we stop the serotonin from going back to the neuron that it was released from.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it means that it stays around longer, and therefore for the same amount of molecules of serotonin, they can then act on the next neuron, and so that improves the behavior. So it depends on the drug that you're using, on how it acts, but that's one example.
Does that kind of mean that it wouldn't go away on its own, anxiety? You kind of have to intervene?
If you've got a neurological issue with it, it's unlikely. But as I mentioned before, like in some of the work that we've been doing in post-traumatic stress disorder, we have noticed that people doing biofeedback, neurofeedback, have been able to reduce their medication quite dramatically, so less than halving. So we have never gotten to the extent where they stop altogether, but certainly they've gone lower and lower. But this is in PTSD. So whether this works in anxiety, I can't really say because I haven't done that, but that's an interesting study perhaps.
But that's still huge to be able to do that. And I suppose if you add a bit of therapy in there as well, that should help.
Yeah, so you can do cognitive behavioural therapy, and there's other types of therapies that you can do depending on what suits you. And I would always suggest don't stay with the first psychologist. Shop around because it's the singer, not the song, that usually makes the difference.
And so you've said cognitive behavioural therapy a couple of times now. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that is? Well,
cognitive behavioural therapy is about becoming aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it. So you're just learning different behaviour patterns, and you're learning how your brain and functions, basically. That's what it's about.
It sounds like anybody could benefit from that.
I think so, yeah.
Excellent. And say it's not you that's anxious, but you've recognised it in someone that you know, a loved one, how can you best support them?
Well, I think one aspect is that you need to validate them. So you really need to accept that, yes, this is what I have or what that person has, so validating is good. And then supporting, so in essence enabling to receive treatment. So I was talking about agoraphobia. If somebody ends up with agoraphobia, well, they're not going to leave their house. So if you notice that people are becoming less and less inclined to go shopping or do other things, well, then you need to think, what's going on, and then you need to try and get them some other way of help. So these days with telemedicine, that becomes a lot easier. And you certainly should watch them a little bit more closely, but don't make it obvious, I suppose, but watch them. So if there's sleeping problems, if there's profuse sweating, like as I mentioned, diarrhea, not going to be, but if they're losing appetite and they're just picking their food, these are sort of very obvious signs. And as I said, if they don't want to go out and they become lethargic, and possibly if they start smoking or smoke more, they're signs that you should be aware of.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say someone should do first if they've noticed that in themselves or in a loved one? What's the first course of action?
Well, I think you need to determine how bad it is and try to possibly pinpoint why you've got it. So there may be a good reason for it. So we were talking about job anxiety. If that's the case, well, then the easiest way to get rid of it, for instance, is to say, I'm going to go on a holiday.
I thought you were going to say quit your job.
Well, that may have to be, but if you end up sort of taking sick leave, for instance, and you may not want to take sick leave because it might leave a stigma with the company, so you take leave. If all of a sudden your heart rate isn't sort of in the roof, you think, oh yeah, it must obviously be the boss. So then you can make the decision to change jobs. So in some instances, you can certainly do something about it, yeah.
You mentioned before about this smartphone app that your department's working on. Are there any other kind of ways that we could use the technology around us to help manage our anxiety?
Well, the technology, yes. one other way of doing it is sort of choose your what you're watching on TV, more than you usually do. So stay away from sort of highly anxious movies. Certainly sort of pick the ones that are sort of more bland. That's one way that you can do it. And certainly there's other, so virtual reality is something that you can sort of now utilize. The Kinect, the Xbox.
Yeah.
So it can, even if you are at home because you're anxious about going out, you can still end up doing more exercise, which is fun. So as you know, you can play golf or tennis or whatever using Xbox, etc. That's the only one that I know of. So excuse me, Sony, etc.
Other consoles do exist.
Yes, they do. I just don't use them. So. Yeah.
But of course, all of that then makes you feel better, which I suppose would make you more capable of dealing with what's giving you the anxiety.
Yes, it changes. So, for instance, if you do exercise, levels of serotonin, etc., go up. You've got a problem with serotonin. If I exercise and I eat certain foods, well, then I'm going to have more serotonin that'll reduce my anxiety. Yeah.
So what you're saying is look after yourself, and if you recognise you might be developing any symptoms, do something about it.
That's right, yeah. Try and pinpoint why you've got the symptom, what's causing it if you can, and then try to do something about it, following the simple rules that I just mentioned. Eat better, try to stay off the TV, etc. Try to get some sleep. If that doesn't work, go and see your physician.
Brilliant. Dr. Herbert, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.